Chapter 15, Depression and Dictatorship. Part 2, A Shift in the American Sense of Order. As the Depression wears on, America's spirit toughens, bringing down the high priests of Wall Street. With the failure of the former god, capitalism, to make any kind of a comeback, a toughening American spirit turned itself into a vindictiveness against those responsible for the Depression. For instance, the elderly inventor and business tycoon Samuel Insull fled to France when the stock market collapsed, moved from country to country until he was arrested in 1934 by the Turkish government and sent back to America. Here he was sent to jail for a brief period. Actually, at his trial, the jury could not find him guilty of violating any particular law or laws, although he certainly was guilty of the moral sin of selling worthless stocks to people who trusted him because of his high position in Wall Street. Also, the collapse of his holding company had wiped out the life savings of some 600,000 shareholders. Also in 1938, a jury convicted and imprisoned Richard Whitney, former president of the New York Stock Exchange from 1930 to 1935, after he pleaded guilty to 2 charges of grand larceny, having embezzled funds from the Stock Exchange Gratuity Fund and elsewhere to cover huge personal and corporate financial losses. Going after the mob. At the same time, Americans became much less tolerant of the colorful doings of Americans' urban bosses and the corruption and violence of the American mobsters. Hot on the trail was the prohibition agent Eliot Ness, leader of the Untouchables, agents who would not accept bribes, and bringing many of them, at least in the New York operations, to court was New York Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey, who from 1935 to 1937 won 72 convictions in 73 of his cases, including Whitney's. So outraged by Dewey's relentlessness was New York mobster Dutch Schultz that he had scheduled a hit on Dewey in 1935, but was himself gunned down by a rival gang in a Newark, New Jersey restaurant just a few days before the scheduled event, which thus never took place. Dewey also ended the career of the New York mob fixer James J. Hines, a Tammany Hall ward heeler who had long protected the likes of Lucky Luciano, Dutch Schultz, Frank Costello, and Joe Adonis by bribing police and judges, Dewey gaining a conviction and a prison sentence for Hines in 1939. The American labor movement toughens up. The failure of the gods of capitalism is met with the rise in labor militancy and the demand for better wages and working conditions, and the willingness to shut down American businesses that do not meet those demands. Leading the way was a very charismatic labor union leader, John L. Lewis, not only willing to take on big, or not so big at this point, business, but also the Republican Party, which traditionally had stood so strongly in support of American capitalism. A favorite target of Lewis's was Kansas Governor Alf Landon, running as the Republican presidential candidate in the 1936 elections, whom Lewis accused of being a mere puppet of the steel industry. By this point, the American labor movement was solidly in the camp of Roosevelt's Democratic Party. There were, of course, many unemployed men out there hungry to find jobs, and when union members went on shut-down strikes against their employers were more than happy to offer the positions of the absentee workers to newcomers, or scabs, as striking workers called them. The hatred of the two groups, strikers and scabs, became very violent, as for instance during the 1937 Republic Steel Strike in Cleveland, in which a battle between the two groups resulted in the death of 18 workers. America's homegrown variety of fascism. As the Depression dragged on, America, as also other countries such as England and France and Spain, seemed to be producing their own varieties of fascist or communist or populist leaders. The times seemed to demand bold leadership, and there were a number of American candidates willing to put themselves forward as just the answer to the nation's problems. Father Charles E. Coughlin. Through his radio reach to 45 million regular listeners, this powerful Catholic priest put forth social commentary on the times. He could be really biting in his attack on the flaws of the country. Eventually he moved more and more to the ultra-conservative right, becoming increasingly anti-Semitic and anti-New Deal, even pro-fascist with respect to events in Europe. The Kingfish, Louisiana Governor Huey Long. Quite a different style was forthcoming from this ambitious Southern populist who talked about taking the money from the rich and giving it to the poor so that there could be a chicken in every American pot. Statistically, that made no sense because confiscating the wealth of the rich would have hardly made a financial difference to the millions of poor Americans. But the rhetoric sold well until an irate medical doctor shot and killed this little Führer wannabe. But somehow America survived these very trying times, probably only by the grace of God. Ideas were floating here and there, political debate was intense everywhere, and after a long period of trying to pull the country out of the Depression, little seemed to have been accomplished in the long run. Liberal humanism versus traditional Christianity. Meanwhile, all this economic stress was shaking the very spiritual foundations of the country. What had happened to America? It seemed almost as if the gods of America had failed the country. In fact, who exactly was at fault? And what seriously at this point could be done to get the country up and moving again? The very popular early 20th century American philosopher John Dewey, who more than anyone else shaped modern American liberal views on education and social reform, was a self-avowed humanist who believed completely in the power of human logic and in man's basic goodness. There was no place in his worldview for God, though he did not attack the idea directly. He simply moved on past the idea of God to build on his ideas of secular liberal reform, entirely around the notion of man's instinctive logic and good intentions. In this, he was very typical of a growing segment of intellectual America. To his way of thinking, Christianity needed to be pushed out of its central position as the foundational worldview of Western society and culture, in order that the way could be made for a birth of a new religion, a secular religion, originally identified as humanism, referred to more often today as secularism, or just simply secularism. The 1933 Humanist Manifesto. In 1933, 34 individuals well placed in the world of academics, the publishing industry, and Unitarian ministry published a Humanist Manifesto calling for a new religion and accompanying social order, focusing on the powers of man. Among those signers was, unsurprisingly, John Dewey. The call for a new religion. quote, religious humanism, unquote. The goal of the Humanist Manifesto was to try to restore a bright light of human optimism in the midst of a very gloomy Great Depression America. As the manifesto states, quote, the time is past for mere revision of traditional attitudes. Science and economic change have disrupted the old beliefs. Religions the world over are under the necessity of coming to terms with new conditions created by a vastly increased knowledge and experience. In every field of human activity, the vital movement is now in the direction of a candid and explicit humanism. In order that religious humanism may be better understood, we, the undersigned, desire to make certain affirmations, which we believe the facts of our contemporary life demonstrate. Today, man's larger understanding of the universe, his scientific achievements, and deeper appreciation of brotherhood have created a situation which requires a new statement of the means and purposes of religion. Such a vital, fearless, and frank religion, capable of furnishing adequate social goals and personal satisfactions, may appear to many people as a complete break with the past. While this age does owe a vast debt to the traditional religions, it is nonetheless obvious that any religion that can hope to be a synthesizing and dynamic force for today must be shaped for the needs of this age. To establish such a religion is a major necessity of the present. It is a responsibility which rests upon this generation." Unquote. Its 15 affirmations made clear the specifics of this new religion. Its beliefs were no creation, but simply self-existent creation. Man as an evolved, natural creature. Truth only through scientific study. The end to theistic, that is, God-based religion. Social concern and service to replace the self-serving profit motive of capitalism. The need to embrace life rather than flee from it, seeing traditional religion, as the famous psychiatrist Freud claimed it to be, as escapist in nature. Of particular interest are several of the affirmations. We quote. Eighth, religious humanism considers the complete realization of human personality to be the end of man's life and seeks its development and fulfillment in the here and now. This is the explanation of the humanist social passion. Ninth, in the place of the old attitudes involved in worship and prayer, the humanist finds his religious emotions expressed in a heightened sense of personal life and in a cooperative effort to promote social well-being. 10th, it follows that there will be no uniquely religious emotions and attitudes of the kind hitherto associated with the belief in the supernatural. 11th, man will learn to face the crisis of life in terms of his knowledge of their naturalness and probability. Reasonable and manly attitudes will be fostered by education and supported by custom. We assume that humanism will take the path of social and mental hygiene and discourage sentimental and unreal hopes and wishful thinking. Unquote. The need to reconstitute certain religious institutions as rapidly as experience allows. These humanists made very clear their intent to remake the religious life of the nation around their modern religious ideals. We quote, 13th, Religious humanism maintains that all associations and institutions exist for the fulfillment of human life. The intelligent evaluation, transformation, control, and direction of such associations and institutions with the view to the enhancement of human life is the purpose and program of humanism. Certainly, religious institutions, their ritualistic forms, ecclesiastical methods, and communal activities must be reconstituted as rapidly as experience allows in order to function effectively in the modern world. End of quote. Socialism instead of capitalism. The dimensions at their direction of social life clearly was in socialist in nature. We quote. 14th, the humanists are firmly convinced that existing acquisitive and profit-motivated society has shown itself to be inadequate, and that a radical change in methods, controls, and motives must be instituted. A socialized and cooperative economic order must be established to the end that the equitable distribution of the means of life be possible. The goal of humanism is a free and universal society in which people voluntarily and intelligently cooperate for the common good. Humanists demand a shared life in a shared world. Unquote. An assessment of the significance of this attempt at a major cultural shift. This document made very clear the point or principle that the basic concepts which underlie idealism or secularism, which it identified as humanism, indeed constituted a new religion. This new religion, humanism, would shake the foundations of Western society and split it into hostile cultural camps. Humanism claimed in the 11th affirmation that it was the path to social and mental hygiene, and that it discouraged sentimental and unreal hopes and wishful thinking. However, there cannot be a philosophy that has again and again built more unreal hopes and wishful thinking on utopian dreams of a new or revolutionary society founded on human perfection. Instead, again and again, it has produced bloody failures that have accompanied every such attempt, beginning with the utopian French Revolution and continuing with every utopian Marxist or communist revolution since then. Even fascism was built on what the Germans believed to be reasonable and manly attitudes, dreamed up by a utopian rationalist named Hitler. Admittedly, the humanism of 1933 had not yet been permitted to see the worst of utopian humanism of the Marxist and fascist variety, but the seeds of disaster were always there if you actually look closely at the philosophy. But the religious blindness of the humanists caused them to fail to see that their philosophy was about the furthest thing possible from social and mental hygiene. The statement that it was a major necessity of the humanists to establish this new religion would later prove to be a huge embarrassment to humanists of the second half of the 20th century. Failing to gain traction in the American culture through popular appeal, there were few converts to the humanist religion, actually made among the American people at large, who at that time remained steadfastly Christian. The humanists, therefore, led importantly by the ACLU, went to the U.S. federal courts to have the courts establish this new religion in America for them. Of course, this was in total violation of the Constitution. But they got around that by backing away from the 1933 Manifesto's claim that humanism sought to establish a new religion. According to the newest logic of the humanists, by 1960 also calling themselves secularists, religion was the matter only of a belief in God, As they now put things, humanists were atheists. They were not led by religion, but by science. They were not seeking to establish a new religion. Oh, really? But only a new realm of scientific truth. The Constitution certainly is not against the promotion of truth. The humanists therefore argued that they should have the right to receive full backing of the federal courts in making their scientific worldview the only one allowed to be taught in the schools to future American generations, and the only viewpoint allowed to be celebrated in the public life of the nation. The Supreme Court, unfortunately, bought the science, not religion argument of the humanists. And so the secular humanists finally succeeded in having religious humanism, or secularism, established as the nation's only acceptable public worldview, that is, religion, in complete violation of the very clear terms of the First Amendment. Karl Marx would have been proud of how American humanists succeeded in freeing the little people from the religious opium of Christianity. This put the humanists in the same league as the Russian Bolsheviks, who used pretty much the same logic to bring a similar anti-Christian intellectual moral monopoly to Russia for 70 years, until the Russian Marxist experiment finally collapsed spiritually, morally, and politically at the end of the 1980s. The growing liberal-conservative split within the church itself. Meanwhile, the mainline churches continue to plunge deeper into fundamentalist liberal infighting. In 1933, J. Gresham Machen, who had left Princeton Seminary and founded Westminster Seminary in order to keep a more traditional evangelical Presbyterian theology alive and well, was finally forced by more progressive Presbyterians out of the Presbyterian denomination itself. He subsequently helped found the conservative Orthodox Presbyterian Church, contributing to the movement of a number of individuals and congregations out of membership in the old mainline denomination. But it was a departure that made mainline Christians truly glad. The splitting off of these disgruntled conservatives merely left the old mainstream Christian churches all the more in the hands of Christian liberals. Within the church itself, conservatives sensed that they were fighting a rearguard action. Liberals felt that history and time were on their side, and soon all reasonable people would be joining them in their modernizing religious camp. To forward-looking Americans, their nation was entering enthusiastically another age of reason. Sadly, the more liberal the churches became, the more they sounded like the secular humanists in the way they approached life. And as the churches drifted further and further in this direction, the more they lost their strong, clear moral voice, once the moral bedrock of American politics. The churches were fast making themselves irrelevant. How ironic. It was their claim that by making themselves look more like the world, they would enhance their influence in the world's affairs. But in fact, the end result was quite the opposite. This cultural movement would not occur as rapidly in America as it had in Hitler's Germany, but the nature of the movement would remain much the same. Man, not God, would be looked to as the savior of this newly rising world. In the midst of this religious transition, one of America's greatest theologians, H. Richard Niebuhr, so tellingly described what was happening to the message of the American church. I quote, "A God without wrath brought men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross." End of quote. Cited in The Kingdom of God in America, 1937.